In 2016, an Indianapolis Star investigation into USA Gymnastics brought to light one of the largest and most significant sexual assault scandals in history, perpetrated by team doctor Larry Nassar, who abused more than 265 victims. One of Nassar's survivors, Rachael Denhollander, happened to see that Star article and contacted the newspaper, becoming the first woman to go public with her account of abuse. As a trained lawyer, Rachael had been meticulously building a case against Nassar after he had treated her when she was a young 15-year-old gymnast in Michigan. Rachael's courageous action upended a system of power and unleashed a torrent of hundreds of other women who brought forward similar allegations against Nassar. Over a period of more than 20 years, at least 7 different women told someone about being assaulted by Nassar, but systemic roadblocks and cover-ups allowed him to continue his abuse at the highest levels of one of America's elite sports, where sponsorships and image trumped athlete safety. Survivors of Nassar included many high-profile U.S. Olympic gymnasts, including gold medalists like Allie Raceman, Gabby Douglas, and Simone Biles. One such notable survivor is Maggie Nichols, who was a contender for the 2016 U.S. Olympic team. Netflix documentary Athlete A tells the story of how Maggie's coach overheard her talking about Nassar's inappropriate behavior. Her coach first reported Nassar to USA Gymnastics in 2015. Thus, Maggie became known as Athlete A in legal documents.
Michigan State University Chief of Police Jim Dunlap and I are announcing today criminal charges against Dr. Larry Nassar.
Nassar was ultimately convicted in the sporting world's biggest reckoning, and it was Rachael who was the last survivor to speak at Nassar's trial and pose the question, what is a girl worth? Nassar pled guilty in both federal and state court, but he never took full responsibility for his actions, leaving the courts to punish him in 2018 to decades behind bars in sentences that will run consecutively, guaranteeing he will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Rachael, I can't really tell you how grateful I am that you are doing this with us today. I know how hard you work and that this work in particular for you never stops. How are you doing? Athlete A is out there. We're living in a whole new world of COVID and social action. How are you and your family doing?
You know, we really take it day by day. I'll be honest, there are a lot of times where I am really exhausted because you're right, this work doesn't ever end. We are still engaged in litigation with USA Gymnastics and with the USOPC. We're not seeing any move toward reform. And after 3 years, that's just exhausting. You know, to be constantly calling for change and just feeling the weight of the danger that kids are in and that our athletes are in, our minor athletes are in on a continual basis, working under an organization that does not prioritize their safety. That's a really heavy thing to carry, and it is exhausting. Yeah, and unfortunately, sexual abuse is something that crosses every boundary. It crosses every religious boundary, every socioeconomic boundary. And when you're surrounded in that all day, every day, it's exhausting.
It's very heavy, heavy work. I want to start by sort of focusing on you, the person, and then get to the work. But how did you become this person who is willing to bear this load? The judge, when she handed down the sentence to Larry Nassar, called you the bravest person she had ever had in her courtroom. How did you become that?
I think there are a lot of factors to that. One of the most important for me, though, is to really recognize that I was always willing to do it. It was having a place to speak out. And for 16 years, I had no hope of being believed because, you know, the thing with gymnastics and really sexual abuse and child abuse in general is it's not really a secret. We like to act like it's a hard thing to pick up on. We like to act like it flourishes in the darkness. But in reality, we've known about this problem for a very long time. We've known about the abusive culture in gymnastics for decades. We've known about the problem of sexual abuse in gymnastics for decades. It was that nobody wanted to listen. And so for 16 years, I didn't feel like I had a place to speak up. We have a justice system that often doesn't prioritize justice for sexual assault victims. So it wasn't until I saw that IndyStar article that I saw any hope of being believed, any hope of being able to get the narrative and get control from these organizations that were surrounding Larry Nassar for decades. And I think that's a really important point to note, because what that really tells us is the question of how do we get victims to speak up? The answer to that is we create a culture where they're safe to speak up. We help our police become trained to handle sexual assault investigations well, because that's the abnormality, not the norm. We train our prosecutors to know how to handle these cases. And we have a victim-centered approach. That's what we had in my case, and the results literally changed the world. But most victims don't have a prosecutor like Angie Povolitis, and they don't have a detective like Detective Mumford. We train our journalists to value and prioritize the importance of telling the truth, no matter what the cost. I had that in the IndyStar team. But that's a relatively recent shift in journalism. And we have so much work to do on a cultural level where victims are able to speak up and be heard and treated seriously rather than immediately attacked and vilified.
You were ready to tell this story, though. You had been compiling your journaling, writing case files. How long had you been putting that together?
Almost 16 years. I saw Larry when I was 15 and saw him from 15 to almost 17. And at the very end of treatment, there was a line he crossed that I realized was abuse. And that really was the beginning of starting to ask those questions. Was there more I missed? Is there more I didn't recognize? Starting to do the medical research, starting to pull my medical files together, talking to experts. And it really was a period of about 16 years of just preparing and knowing what it was going to cost. And my mom and I actually had a conversation when I was 17 as we were starting to put these things together and just starting to kind of figure out what might be going on. And she said, what are we going to do with this? And my answer to that was, there's nothing right now that we can do with this. Because we knew based on his interactions with me that I wasn't the first victim, not by any stretch, and that he also wasn't stopping. And what that told me at that point in time was, whoever is speaking up is being silenced. It wasn't that no one had spoken up. I was sure of that. It was that whoever was speaking up was being silenced. And so I said to my mom at 17, there's nothing I can do without press involvement. There's got to be a way to get the narrative away from USAG, from USOPC, from this university that is undoubtedly sheltering him. There's got to be a way to take control from them, or this isn't going to go anywhere. And at 17, we just had no way to do that. Journalism was very different back then. The culture was even worse back then for sexual assault victims. And so it really was a period of 16 years of putting all that material together and just waiting for a chance.
Something I hear all the time in relation to sexual assault cases is they refer to the law. They refer to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. So how do you talk to people? How do you say, okay, here's how I reconcile believing a survivor, believing a victim, and understanding the rule of law?
I think there are a couple layers to that. The first is understanding that, yes, we have a presumption of innocence. And that's an important part of our justice system. It is. But what does that actually mean? And how does that interplay? And so when we hear an allegation, what that really means is to treat it like it matters, to treat it like it's serious, to not have that knee-jerk community protectionism response. Oh, she's bitter. She's in it for money. She's just angry. She just has a political motivation. To say, wait a minute, this is serious. I recognize that 92 to 98% of allegations are true. And so I need to approach this with that reality in mind. We hear a lot about the danger of false allegations, and that's something we want to pay attention to. But I have a son, and I live with the reality that my son is far more likely to be a victim of sexual assault than he is to be a victim of a false allegation. And so my main priority for my son is protecting him from sexual abuse. That's a much greater risk to my child, even my male children, than a risk of a false allegation is. And so when someone speaks up, we bear that reality in mind. We hear those allegations in light of what we actually know about sexual abuse. And then we also need to become much better educated as to what trauma responses look like and what evidence looks like. Because most of the time when you hear someone saying, oh, this person must be lying because, most of the time what they're using as evidence isn't actually evidence that something didn't happen. It's a normal trauma response. Oh, that didn't happen because she took too long to speak up. Actually, the median age of disclosure, especially for a child abuse or abuse that happens with minors, is often into their 30s and 40s, if not 50s. It takes decades for victims of sexual abuse to be ready to speak up. That's the norm. It's not an abnormal thing. We need to understand trauma responses. We need to understand what evidence looks like. We need to understand how abusers manipulate and masquerade. When a victim speaks up, one of the first things they always hear is, oh, that's not possible because. And then the person saying it has some reason why the person accused couldn't really be an abuser, or the abuse couldn't have happened the way the victim alleged. There were too many people around. You didn't speak up enough. Why didn't you cry out? And the reality is the very things that are causing us to say, oh, that's not possible because, oftentimes those are the very things keeping that abuser in power. It's the normal freeze responses. It's the shock responses, the trauma responses, the grooming and the manipulation and the confusion that the abuser relies on to be able to stay in power. And when we have that automatic knee-jerk response, that's not possible because we have done exactly what the abuser wanted us to do. We have become part of the problem. We have to stop those knee-jerk responses and understand what evidence really looks like in a sexual assault case and understand what evidence isn't in a sexual assault case so that we can make a wise determination as to those allegations.
I read your victim impact statement and it brought me to tears, and I would encourage anybody out there to take a look. It was unbelievable, but sort of what has, I guess, now become your sort of signature line is, what is a girl worth? And now you have a book of that title and you have a children's book, How Much is a Little Girl Worth? Can you answer that question? What is a girl worth?
I asked my kids that when I read them the little girl's book. I said, how much are you worth, precious girl? That's how it starts out. And I said, what do you think the answer is? And my daughters turned around and they're dressed in their little princess nightgowns. And they turned around and they said, everything, Mommy. That's right. Worth everything. And that is the quintessential question that we always have to ask. That really is the question at the heart of everything we do. What is a person worth? Because every decision we make, whether it is to engage with an issue or to stay silent, whether it is to tell the truth or to just sit in the shadows, every single decision we make, we are taking out a scale. And on one side, we're putting the interests that we hold dear. And on the other side of the scale are the people who are going to pay the price for the decisions we make. And then we're deciding which one matters more. And more often than not, we decide that those goals matter more than the people who are going to pay the price for the choice that we make. That question of how much is a person worth, that's the question we're answering every time we make a decision, whether or not we realize it. It wasn't a nice byline. Yeah, that really is the question we have to answer every single time we make a decision. It is at the heart of our ethics. It's at the heart of our moral compass. How much is a person worth?
I'm going to leave you with the final question that we've been asking all of our guests, and I have a feeling you'll have a lot to say. I'm wondering what your advice to a young Rachael would be.
I think the first thing I would tell her is it's not your fault, and to release that false guilt. It's not your fault. And the second thing is to hold to what's true. You know what's true. And you can tell the truth and you can speak the truth. And truth is not dependent on the response you receive from society. What is true exists independent of how our culture behaves. And you can hold to what is true no matter what. And that gives you the freedom to grieve the damage and also to look to the hope that's still there.
Well, I know so many need to hear that. So I am so grateful to have had you on this show with us, Rachael. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for making time for the conversation.